Okay, great. We'll give it one more minute while people join. But again, thank you for joining us wherever you're calling in from. I'm out of San Francisco, so classic SF fashion. It is super foggy and cold here, and we're joined with Josh and John. Just some quick housekeeping notes before we get started. So this is going to be recorded, so it'll hopefully be a resource for you or anyone on your team, and we'll be sure to send the recording out afterwards. I'll make this plug many times during the webinar, but we're going to have live Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the Zoom chat, and myself and John and Josh will get to it at the end too. Cool. With that, I think it's probably good for us to get started. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Let me know if there's any issues, John and Josh.
Looks good.
Cool. Okay. So just for a quick agenda, we're going to do introductions so you know who you're hearing from. I'll do a little bit of an overview on the candidate fraud kind of like life cycle and what it really entails. We know that this is a highly requested topic after we talked about it actually at MRMC, a marketplace conference, a few months ago. So we're really excited to bring it here to this wider group. And then we're actually going to have a live discussion and hear a little bit from especially John and his experience at Liveops, which is a pretty large staffing company and has a lot to share on this topic. And like I said, we'll have Q&A at the end. Cool. So just for quick introductions, I'm Shana. I'm a product marketing lead at Persona, focused on our solutions.
Hi, and I'm John Wheeler. I'm with Liveops. We are a CX company that oversees many thousands of candidates, sometimes weekly. And I'm the enterprise architect here at Liveops, overseeing technical integration and all sorts of things here in the background. So thank you so much for having me today.
I'm Josh Cutler. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Yardstik, and we're a risk reduction company, so we make sure that the people you're hiring are who they said they were and have the backgrounds that you want them to have.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you again both for lending your time. And we'll breeze through the company introductions, but if you aren't familiar with Persona, we are a identity verification platform. Within the last few years, we've actually started touching on not just KYC and KYB, but what we call KYE, Know Your Employees. So today, we, alongside like our partners like Yardstik, cover everything from onboarding and verification to now also like workforce authentication, including access management, re-verification, and even offboarding. And Josh, I know you mentioned a little bit about Yardstik, but anything else you want to add here?
No, we work closely with Persona to make sure, like I said, that we can do identity verification. We work pre-hire, at point of hire. We run background screens in addition to license verifications, education, all the things you typically think of. I think where we're a little different is that we also think about what happens post-hire and making sure that the people you hired are still who you thought they were and meet your risk criteria. So we take a pretty holistic look at risk reduction across your workforce.
That's right. And Liveops works closely with Yardstik. So Yardstik is one of our vendors associated with that really key moment at the very beginning of the funnel, and then also dispersed throughout the life cycle of the agent. We interact really closely with independent contractors. And so we have a wide set of requirements that Yardstik has been working really closely with us to make sure that we have a reduced risk profile, while also maintaining a really straightforward collaboration and flexible interaction throughout our time together.
Amazing. Yeah, and we're very excited to dig into, I think, Liveops' experience with both Yardstik and Persona in a little bit too. So like I mentioned, we wanted to do some context setting before really jumping into a discussion. So I think folks here are probably all familiar with the hiring process. I think all of us have been on at the very least one side of it to get into our current role. But I think it's important to break down why this matters so much for for employers, right? A hiring process is often a company's first touch point with a potential employee. So it's really about how do you attract, evaluate, and decide who joins your team. And it also sets the tone for, oops. You all are seeing my speaker notes, which is not the worst thing in the world, but I want to make sure that you have the full presentation. Okay. It is really about setting the tone for anyone who goes through your recruiting funnel. So we also know at the same time that Gen AI has fallen in the hands of not just, employees at your company, but also fraudsters or candidates who want to make their way into your respective hiring process. So we wanted to spend some time and talk about like the different types of candidate fraud that we've seen pop up. So this is always like a stat that we think is pretty astonishing, right? Gartner projects that 1 in 4 job applicants could be fake by 2028. And if you actually break that down, there's different ways that like a fake candidate can actually manifest. So this, I don't know if we'll play here, or maybe I'll try to play it without sound. This is a pretty shocking clip that made its way on LinkedIn, I think a few months ago. It was a job interview with like a cybersecurity company, and the candidate actually ended up being like a deep faked kind of video. This is the one I think that appears in the headlines the most, but there's many other different types of candidate fraud that might pop up during the applicant process, whether it's synthetic IDs, which are a combination of fake and real information that pop up during the application intake process, actual like deep fakes or proxy interviews that might happen during the video call, or large scale impersonation during onboarding and beyond, where someone is working with a wider network of other candidates or other employees of your company. I think this is most famously exemplified in the North Korea IT kind of headline that made its way around like news outlets, I think a few months ago. So there's many different types of candidate fraud, and if you're interested in kind of hearing or face challenges of one in particular, we'd love to hear about it, and don't be afraid to ask about it in the Zoom chat. And I think this is another thing that I know is probably top of mind for folks, but we wanted to really dig into like why fraud during the hiring process isn't just about bad hires, right? There's also, first and foremost, like a large aspect of potential financial loss or fraud. Stories that we've heard about is, folks actually joining a company to get access to like office systems and then stealing funds for that. I think, again, there's also a recent headline with someone trying to phish at least a very popular cryptocurrency exchange. We saw this happen, I think, a few months ago. There's also compliance risks too. So if you, end up hiring someone who, again, is potentially from a sanctioned country, that also raises potential compliance risks for your own company. And lastly, reputational risk, right? Hiring the wrong person doesn't just matter for your company or that specific team, and it can also scare away potential like good hires too. So there's a lot of things at stake when it comes to thinking about like candidate fraud within your own kind of like recruiting process. So we're kind of excited to actually break this down and, like I said, we have a pretty lively discussion today with Liveops and Yardstik. So we're going to spend some time on like 3 chapters, really talking about, the risk factors for candidate fraud. We know we have a lot of folks here from different companies and different industries. We'll kind of talk about which ones are especially prone to this type of fraud vector. We'll spend some time and even have some actual examples of like common Gen AI fraud vectors and how Liveops spotted them. And lastly, we'll spend some time and talk about how, as you're thinking about a potential solution to catch like candidate fraud in whatever form it takes, how you can take different signals that span, the initial kind of like applicant intake to the interview process to finally like IDV and background checks to really catch bad actors along the way. So with that, I think we might start on this like first chapter and really just talk about like risk factors for candidate fraud. Let me pull up our questions really quick. And I think maybe the first question to ask, like John, is, from your experience, John, do you mind talking a little bit about what you've seen as potential risk factors for candidate fraud and, how Liveops has mitigated that in your own experience?
Yeah, so Liveops has been around for quite a long time. It's been around since 2000. We recently celebrated our 25th year. That said, we've experienced a lot of different kinds of candidate fraud throughout our history. Um, in the beginning, it was pretty simple. It was pretty straightforward. It was the risk factor was loss of money because of time theft, basically. So a user would sign up for our service, not perform services, and utilize loopholes to effectively get money in exchange for time that they didn't perform services for. That's not a humongous risk factor, but it is a monetary risk factor, right? We have obligations to our clients, we have obligations to our clients' customers, and thus, that lack of experience, or the lapse in customer experience can be really damaging to the reputation of the client that we're interacting with, because if a customer calls in and hears empty silence, that's a really lame experience, and that can damage the reputation of our client. That's a pretty like low risk, however, in comparison to what can be possible. We're starting to see this more and more now, where a bad actor is utilizing um, a service like ours to gain access to a client system and gain access that they wouldn't normally have, and be able to therefore perform actions like larger scale fraud. So that could be things like ordering stuff that they didn't purchase. That could be participating in fraud at a larger scale than simple time theft, but could be in the many thousands of dollars, and that damages our reputation with our client. And then we're also starting to see fraud rings, so chains of individuals that all participate in fraud in slightly different ways, such that they can either gain access to a system, provide time, do time theft, but also gain access that they wouldn't otherwise have, and also utilize that service to do what is essentially phishing. These risk factors all culminate to a reputational risk, monetary risk, and also a risk to time. These bad actors are not, even a double-digit number of people that we're interacting with. This is, less than a single percentage point of the number of candidates that we interact with. And so there's kind of a time sink that occurs that prevents us from being able to from participating in the opportunities that could otherwise improve our revenue. So thereby, it's an opportunity cost that we are putting resources into something as like a 5 alarm fire situation that we could have otherwise done something more with higher ROI. All of that said, having really great partners has been really important to this. And that's why I think folks like Yardstik and Persona have been really important to us mitigating these and improving our position on this.
Yeah, I definitely recognize the wage arbitrage component is something that we've talked a bit about. Josh, from your vantage point, like what have you seen as different risk factors for
Yeah.
certain employees or companies?
So when I look across like our customer base and just the kind of world of hirers, there's a few themes that pop out. So one, the more hiring you do, the higher your risk, right? And that's just a function of even small percentages of things that can slip through the cracks happen at scale. Um, so if you're hiring a lot, you're also working on volume and speed, and you care about throughput and time to butts and seats, and that can make it such that you don't want to introduce friction. So that's I think a starting point. If you hire 2 people a year and you interview them and they come into the office, it's really hard to have fraud in those situations. Um, but I would say most of the risk factors are just kind of downstream of the problem, that there is a lack of kind of a social trust layer on the internet generally. And by that, I mean, if your business is purely virtual, it is much more susceptible to wage arbitrage because people don't have to show up in the office. The fewer your touch points and the more those are wholly digital, the higher your risk. because that's where things like Gen AI can come into play. And touch points are not just like do identity verification and run a background check. They're like, do you even interview this person? So if your workforce is something where you're not doing, face-to-face interviews, it's much easier to fake an identity. If your workforce is one that never actually comes into the office and meets the person who interviewed them, right? Let's say you do delivery, they show up at a warehouse, the person who was a part of their hiring is never a part of their day-to-day job. That's an opportunity for identity theft, right? And so, kind of all of the things you see across the internet, in e-commerce, in AI slap in your social media feed, like the more digital it is, the more susceptible it is to this. Both because the tools now exist for this, but also you can do it at scale. It's really hard to do fraud at scale when you actually have to show up and be the same person in the interview who shows up to do the work.
Yeah, I think that actually tees us up for like the next kind of like chapter or section two, particularly about Gen AI's role in accelerating fraud. Maybe just to like kind of recap on this risk factors chapter, though, it does sound like a lot of the commonalities include things like, is it a high throughput hiring process? Are there like remote employers or also like the potential for like wage arbitrage depending on like location or role type? Yeah, and I think that's tracks of what we've seen on the persona side and where we see a lot of the demand come in for candidate fraud solutions. I think like maybe to dig a little bit into the role of Gen AI and how it's being used by both, yeah, candidates good and bad. John, I know we've worked pretty heavily with we and Yardstik and Persona have worked pretty heavily with your team on potential solutions here for Liveops. Can you share a little bit about your experience and maybe start from the beginning of like the type of fraud that you've seen and how it slipped past traditional checks and then what ended up working with I think the help of the wider team.
Yeah, so when we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about the different kind of modalities that are possible to be generated using what we would refer to as artificial intelligence. So you can think through text. In terms of if you had some sort of an interview process, it could generate the answers to that interview. We've seen a bit of that. The things that are probably a greater point in this discussion are going to be generating images. So being able to generate a driver's license. These systems are getting good enough where a generated driver's license could reasonably fool a, um, a, a an expert, a human expert in identifying driver's licenses. It'll have all the watermarks, it'll have all the parts and pieces, and it'll be pretty convincing. But it's made up of somebody who doesn't exist, or it's made up of somebody who has had their identity stolen, potentially from just basic social networks or off of what we would refer to as like the dark web. The so generative AI is kind of getting mixed with the experience of the you call it old-fashioned identity fraud. We're mixing that with generative AI, and you're being able to basically conjure up a pretty realistic person that could, in theory, fool somebody who's interviewing somebody virtually and then checking their documents virtually. And that's why having database connections is really important. So what we've worked with Yardstik on is a number of different points in that funnel that allow us to check IDs, for example, do background checks, and also we have a number of other systems. So since we bring on independent contractors are responsible for the payment of their background check. And a creative solution that we came up with Yardstik is actually Yardstik began utilizing payment processing as another vector from which we can identify a fraudulent person. Josh, you might be able to speak more on this concept.
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple of impacts of Gen AI, and then I'll follow up on what John said there because I think it's the takeaway is that there is no one answer, but multiple data points across multiple vectors are how you beat this. So why is this a new problem? Well, it is a kind of a new problem, but it's also not a new problem. We have enough people on this webinar that I am positive that some of you had fake IDs in college so you could go to the bars. It was always possible to get them. They were expensive. And what Gen AI has done is they have made it such that it is so cheap and so fast that what was maybe not a realistic risk, just from a pure economics perspective for fraudsters 10 years ago, is now. And so there's a combination of both not having the tools in place at all, but also this being a cat and mouse game. This is an emerging technology. Um, if we had a system that could detect 100% of Gen AI fake people and IDs today, it wouldn't work in 6 months, right? And so investing in the game, which is bad actors are going to keep getting better, we need to keep getting better, is just the moment that we're in. And what can you do to kind of win the game? Well, it's to start thinking about other touch points you have with the candidate, right? Any given step in your defense can be breached. But the goal is that not all of them are breached because the bad actor actually has to breach all of your defenses. And so that's why when we look at fraudulent actors in hiring funnels, it's a combination of, do your documents match your face? Are you a known bad actor? Because we've seen a ton of volume across all the people that work with Yardstik and Persona. Can we match your payment signals, which are yet another thing you would have to go get legitimate. And so the more you can stack these things up and they all have to collate correctly with one another, just the harder it is for the fraudster. And at a certain point to say, you know what? I don't actually want to commit fraud with these people. I'm going to go somewhere else where it's a little bit easier.
Okay.
And so taking that kind of, what are all of our touch points? How do we make all of this data work well together? And how do you, as a someone who's doing the hiring, make sure that like all of your vendors are data sharing and working together to help you? I think is a where we have to be right now, because given the technology landscape, any one of them could fail because of breakthroughs tomorrow, but not all of them are going to fail at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to actually show some of these examples of some of these like fraud attempts in Liveops' funnel, which John has graciously allowed us to show. And I think this really speaks to like the cat and mouse kind of aspect that you were talking about, Josh.
Mhm.
I think again, a theme we hear both on like the KYC and KYE side is like you really need to take a multi-layered approach. And one tension that I know we have a bit more on the employee or candidate kind of like hiring side is, there's less information that once that is like typically shared. Like we're, used to presenting our ID maybe to, get KYC'd for a bank account, but it's a little different when you're applying for a job. So I love this idea of also bringing in creative signals like, are you willing to pay for your own background check? Or like, what are other just data points that you can look at to really assess if a candidate is potentially like a good candidate or not? John, I'd love if you want to voice over a little bit about kind of your experience here, or maybe point out some of those fraud vectors that you saw, it might be helpful for the room.
Yeah, and if you look at this slide, what you see all right, there's the steps in the process. So we've been able to identify these by having the user provide a liveness check and also provide the identity. That combination of things is really important. So if you present an identity, you don't necessarily present the existence of the person holding the ID. And so that's why a liveness check combined with an ID verification is so valuable to this step. And that's why you get all three of these as opposed to just two. What you see are pretty convincing driver's licenses. Some of these are real driver's licenses of real people with different photos sort of injected into the photo. Some of these are purely generated, and it would be very difficult for a person, even myself, who's seen quite a lot of driver's licenses, or my, my fraud analyst, it would be very difficult for them to identify these things and be able to differentiate between true and false. And so there's another step in this, which Yardstik deals with, which is taking the information and comparing it to a real government database. And that's that third layer in this very short, fairly low friction step in identifying that this person is both a real person and has an identity, and that identity belongs to that real person. So that mix, that three-legged stool, is very important in this transaction. This also happens to be fairly friction-free when you're doing an IDV or an ID verification, because it's really just a liveness check. It's a scan of the front and back of the card, and it takes, fairly just about less than a minute. But the IDV check found these despite the fact that I don't know if I would be able to differentiate this from a regular ID. Would you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Josh, I know you were close to this. Are there any other signals that were really helpful for Liveops here, or that you've seen other kind of like innovative customers look at? I know you mentioned around looking at payment information. I'm curious if there's anything else that sticks out.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird, and this is the cat and mouse game. But there's kind of the low level, just latent fraud of people trying stuff. And then there's like true fraud rings that are applying 2, 3, 400 times with different identities. And so one of the approaches we've taken is actually identifying the individuals involved in fraud rings and blacklisting those. And so some of the faces here have applied 100, 200 times. We know that if the biometrics associated with this person who are applying, like we should flag it and identify this is a known fraudster. And so one of the opportunities you have when you see enough of this is to leverage data based on your overall learnings, right? Don't treat every one of these as a one-off blank whiteboard. I wonder if this is a good actor. So that's been an opportunity for us. And then look, Gen AI still makes mistakes. It's funny. They will have a driver's license that looks perfect, except and my favorite example is they just listed the height as 1 foot. I have no idea why. I don't know why that was in the Gen AI trading set, but it was like no one was 1 foot. It was great. Persona flagged it for us. We're like, I actually had to stare at it for like 5 minutes to figure out what the heck was wrong with it. Um, so all of this is to say that I think the answer is very much about working with people who are best in class at these things and trying to layer your defenses, right? And that's what we found has worked best, right? Look, not everyone makes people pay for their own background checks. That's one leg of a potential stool that comes out, but that doesn't mean you can't do all the other stuff. And so that's what we found is that our customers who are most willing to potentially even share data they have about people who have been working there for a while, but now maybe have a risk signal. We're able to collate that in partnership and really just help them kind of clean up their hiring process.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. And I will definitely plus one the link analysis, or like looking at, you know, how often this particular like data point shows up
Mhm.
entire candidate fraud population. Um, like I think if I recall correctly, at least with Liveops, it was helpful in looking at particular selfies or images and seeing, okay, is this selfie similar enough to another one showing up in that
Yep.
applicant pool? But you can take that kind of concept and apply it to many other data points you might have during the hiring process, whether it's, like the IP address of the person submitting the application. Is it like some sort of attribute that's like listed on their resume? And even if that's not like the bulletproof layer, it is like a helpful layer in your hiring defenses.
yeah. And I think as we transition, I think what's important to identify in the cat and mouse game is having a good team to be your cat. So that is, we are we are not alone in tackling candidate fraud, and we're not alone in the world, but we often believe that we are, that our human resources or talent acquisition or agent acquisition element is wholly unique and also all alone in our troubles. And what we've discovered in our interaction with folks like Yardstik and Persona is that we are not. And a lot of the problems that we are trying to solve for are either solved for or better solved with friends. And so the really important decision that we made really early on in our cat and mouse game, or I wouldn't say early on, it was kind of mid on. We've had previous vendors in the past, and we've had different kinds of relationships with those vendors. In our most recent vendor search, we prioritized how are these people going to be to work with on a very regular basis? And how are these people going to be in interacting with us in those moments where a fraud thing happens and we need to deal with it right now? What's the kind of relationship that we will have with this group? And what we found in Yardstik, and by prioritizing that in our our RFP process, was finding a group that's going to work really closely with us in those moments and be a good partner and have already probably considered how to deal with this ahead of time, and also not be so precious about data and be coordinate alongside their large database with us to help us solve the problem that we're attempting to solve for.
Yeah, I appreciate you shouting out the work, especially of the Yardstick and Persona team, John. I think one question I'll ask on behalf of a lot of the HR folks who are probably logged onto this webinar is when you're thinking about adding more defenses to your hiring process, like what were the big changes that you did? I know you mentioned, really partnering with vendors. I'm curious if there are any other integrations or ways that you added or thought about your overall hiring process that might shed some lessons for folks in the crowd.
Yeah, I think that there's there's a big highlight on the front end of the process. That front end of the process, that hiring funnel followed then by an onboarding funnel, is a very important part and a very important puzzle piece to lock into this, but it's part of a much larger whole. What we're finding is candidates will come in as one person and then work as another. And so it's targeting those points after the hiring funnel and identifying ways that we can bring forward useful signals in identifying folks post acquisition. So that is at single sign-on. So if you have an Okta situation or you have some sort of Microsoft Entra or something along those lines, those can trigger various fraud signals to occur based on location or rough location. They can trigger fraud signals based on device and radical movement of device. So those kinds of signals are important to track. It is utilizing the features of some of these tools, and bringing them together. So it's taking logs from what you might consider not useful in identifying fraud signals, where did this person send this email from, and bring them together. And then when they get brought together from multiple angles, you can sometimes identify threads that identify that this person could be not who they say they were. But it's also about considering friction. So you don't want somebody every time they're signing in to have to do a liveness check and tap their ID. Persona might like that, but the folks who have to log in every single day may not. And so it's about having risk factors that accumulate into scores. And there's some tools and there's lots of products that are available that can help with that. And some of them are available, via links from this call. But it is about combining lots of signals that you might not otherwise consider for fraud and bringing them together both at the funnel and at the totality of the employee lifecycle.
Yeah, I loved what you said there. I think one of the conversations whenever we onboard new customers is the tension between friction in onboarding and accuracy as you assess a candidate or a worker. Um, and I think one of the things that is lost is that it doesn't have to be one size fits all, right? You're not necessarily saying I'm going to do this sequence of events for every candidate. The capacity to step up and say, you know what, there is a little bit of a weird risk indicator here. We know this job is based in Florida, but this person is based in Belarus. Maybe we should actually do an identity verification on this person. And who knows, maybe they're on vacation. They'll call you up and deal with it. Or maybe they're a fraud actor. But that is enough of a signal that you're actually going to alter the happy path. Like that is what our most sophisticated customers are doing to navigate the friction versus accuracy trade-off. And that's exactly what you described doing in a post-hire world. You don't want everyone to, re-verify themselves every day they log in, but there are absolutely behaviors and activities you might notice that say, all right, let's have this person do it. And so both like finding the balance between friction and accuracy isn't one size fits all, either at the beginning or the end of your hiring process. And it can be dynamic throughout. And I think once you open your mind to that, all of a sudden the trade-offs become a lot easier to reason about.
Yeah. And I think the thing I will underscore too is it has a lot of benefits, again, for HR teams or like the good candidates moving through your life cycle when you
Yes.
take this like dynamic friction approach. It also means that the folks who should be moving through your process quickly are versus taking a one size fits all. And again, it seems like another lesson I know we might be more familiar with on like the KYC side. I wanted to also ask like the role of any other kind of like systems or data points that you look at, John. So one of the things that we often hear from customers is like we really want to understand what are the signals that make sense during the candidate hiring process. What should we look at? I know, again, not to harp on this, but we mentioned looking at like location or IP address or, are you willing to pay for your own background check? Before we kind of close out this part of the discussion, anything else you two want to add in terms of these might be relevant signals to consider, and feel free to caveat it if it's like for a specific use case. One that comes to mind for me is like looking or comparing kind of like information. So not just like
Yeah.
where you're located, but has that changed over time throughout like the
Mhm.
interview process? Yeah.
Yeah, it's data over time is going to be really important. You can think of any data that you can get from the user at any point as a potential thing to collect and thing to measure and thing to monitor over time. And honestly, this is a really just good data practice is collect as much information, store it in a standardized way, and be able to have it over time. When you have that kind of information, now you can start collecting information that links those things together. So it's location, a location over time. It's IP address, and in some cases, the MAC address or device address that it gets communicated from the user's device. It is the information like their application usage, if you have access to that. So things like Slack or Microsoft Teams or Zoom, they have chat features and they'll communicate that information to you. Those kinds of vectors are really important. And I think Josh over at Yardstik, you probably have an interesting opinion on this.
Yeah. So I I don't want to list them all because I'm sure fraudsters can get access to this as well and change their behaviors, but I'll say a couple things. Um, First, 100%, your data should be the same throughout the process. Like that is a huge red flag. And if you have disconnected vendors that don't talk to each other, like we've talked to people where an identity verification passed, but that wasn't even the same information that was in the background check, nor was it the same application that was like the application itself, right? Three different systems, three different vendors. No one really thought to connect the dots. It sounds simple, but you actually have to do it, right? And then you can get more sophisticated. Were the locations roughly the same throughout, things like that. Um, in terms of just random identifier that I think is actually really helpful. So bad actors like to fake their locations using VPN, so virtual private networks. But sloppy bad actors forget to update their time zone. So you'll see them in Florida, but their time zone will be Russian, and you're like, that's odd. I wonder why someone in Miami has a Russian time zone set on their laptop. And there's a lot of things like that that you can look for that are those red flags.
Yeah, I appreciate the tips and I agree. We can't give too much information in case there are fraudsters on the call, but I think that is worth highlighting. I'm going to make one more plug for questions. We're going to probably wrap up soon, but I thought it'd be interesting to use this as like the backdrop for our last question, which is, this webinar is about candidate fraud, but again, what we've been talking about is like using information during the hiring process and also considering it throughout the employee life cycle. Um, Maybe a good question for Josh. I am curious how your most like forward-looking customers are thinking about this, or any other lessons that you can tell us from, um, how to think about securing the
Yeah.
entirety of the employee life cycle.
Yeah, so I think it's on theme. It's about consistency. So I'd say the area where most of our customers now are starting to think is about what happens post-hire. And John and I have actually talked at length about opportunities to strategically, without bothering the people who work with Liveops, do identity re-verification, right? And there's a lot of signals why you might do this, but is what do you do now when you have already have someone in your workforce, but there are signals that maybe this is not actually the person you hired. Now, there are scenarios where you're doing kind of delivery, you go pick stuff up at a warehouse where you've never seen anyone, where it's actually pretty easy to not be the person who was hired. But even people who go into the office now are potentially having someone else do the identity verification and background check, and a different person shows up. And so that um, threat vector, I think, is the one that people are really starting to think about now. And like, what are the right triggers, as well as checks to make sure that your workforce is who you think it is? Because that's a pretty scary scenario for anybody who's hiring if your employees are not who you actually think they are.
Yeah, I was also gonna say, I think on the note of, I really loved your point about like having vendors or systems or partners that talk to each other. And what I've seen some of our customers who are really concerned about this, like really think about, okay, what do integrations to our ATS systems look like? What do
Hmm.
integrations to the video conferencing software that's used during the interview process? Like, what does that look like? Or how does that potentially tie in with some of the um, IDV or other vendors that you might be using like later on in the employee life cycle.
Yeah, and this is a very important topic, just generally in data and data management. It's really important, I think, to identify good partners to help with this, because in order to remain compliant and to meet all the various regulations related to data and the movement of information, you do want really good rigor around that. When you work with good partners, then you can find those connections much more easily because those partners, like Yardstik, have interacted with these systems in the past. And so it's important to identify opportunities to connect information and centralize it as often as possible. And then also to use that information in interesting and valuable ways.
Yeah, one small detail I think folks will get tripped up on is oftentimes like the definition of some of these like signals we talk about might differ across your vendors too. So
Totally.
a small note I might add is like, as folks are thinking about constructing this process, it's like to Josh's point, like how do you define what a VPN is, and does it mean the same thing in your IDV versus your background check versus
Hmm.
your ATS system? And doing the work of making sure that those definitions are aligned will make your life easier too. I think we're still waiting on Q&A, so maybe last question for us, Josh and John, is like any final takeaways or anything that you want to leave like the audience with before we kind of move into Q&A?
I think something that LiveOps had to take a lot of bruises with is finding good partners. to work with, to find these, to work in that moment. There's a moment in every fraud situation where every alarm goes off and we have to do something right now. And it's finding a good partner that can interact with you in that moment and have already interacted with you in moments past. There's a prop I could throw up, which is like we have a Slack channel with Yardstik, which if you scroll through it, it goes on forever. And that's because we're interacting with each other as a team, as an extension of our team. And so I think it is about, I think the bruise that we have healed over time is find a partner and emphasize in the RFP process a partner that you can interact with that will that will step up to do the work with you when the moment is important, and then do the background work when be preventative after the fact. And it's also about technology. So it's identifying good partners that can do IDV frictionless. That's a hard problem to solve for. So ID verification frictionless, can do the background checks in a pretty frictionless way, reduce the amount of time. All of those are SLAs that service levels that are important to hit, and most everybody is doing that well. But I think the big thing that I would emphasize for anybody seeking out preventing fraud is have friends that know fraud and can work with you to prevent it with you.
I love that. And I guess all I'll add, because I think I agree with everything you said there, John, is that we keep saying it's cat and mouse game, but like anybody who tells you they have the answer that solved it all today is lying. They just are. The fraud that we are seeking to combat are professionals who derive their income from this, and they get better at it every day. Which means that your partners and you have to get better at it every day. And you're not on your own. There's a whole bunch of people who are going to try to solve this problem. But as you think about who you want to work with, I think the people who are realistic about the problem are the ones who are going to help you stay in a good spot, even if they can just get you there today. It won't be there tomorrow.
Yeah. I think one point that I might add, since I feel like we touched on so many great themes, and I don't want to belabor another discussion on dynamic friction or connecting systems, but I will just say, like, I think the data aspect is a really interesting one. I think particularly for folks in HR or high volume hiring processes, like Josh mentioned, there's so much data that folks are tracking, whether it's like, time to initial interview or time to, having a quote like button seat. And I think as we think about like candidate fraud, there's hopefully a lot of like levers that one can look at to make sure that, hey, this fraud prevention or these friction points that we're adding aren't, I think we have what it takes to actually measure the impact of those things. I think it's also worth calling out again, like candidate fraud or, folks potentially putting in bad applications that also just like kind of dirties up the data in the initial parts of the hiring process. And just I think considering that or thinking about these things as like related parts will help make a better candidate experience overall too. Cool. Well, I think while we were doing takeaways, I did see some questions come in, which is great. Maybe a question that I think will be a fun one for us to answer is like, or what is our prediction of where fraud will go / evolve in the next 3 to 5 years? Any,
My
yeah,
take on this is that fraud actors will continue to get better, but I think that it will impact people at a greater amount. So that is the general cost of a fraud actor will go up, and however, I also think that the tools will get better to prevent them and become more democratized and become less custom and become more of a product that you can buy off of the shelf. I think there was a if you look at the graph, like there was probably a cost reduction as a result of AI and indexing and various things associated with HR platforms. I think that that cost will come back to normal, and I think you will spend more per candidate,
Mhm.
but you will get better candidates is the outcome. I think the data will be easier to connect to things, and we will get tertiary benefits from that beyond just fraud identification and fraud analysis. It'll just help the onboarding cycle. And I think the tools will start to transition from just general fraud stuff and more towards speeding up your pipeline and improving that pipeline. And I think identity is going to become a lot more uh, of a of a point and click kind of operation, mostly like easy apply on LinkedIn or single
Mhm.
sign on with your Apple account. You'll be able to apply to a job and you'll be able to get a lot more information more quickly. And I think a lot of those platforms will support us in identifying that these folks are who they say they are. And so I think that the general direction is lower friction for people who are good, higher friction for people who are bad, and improved throughput generally. I think that the hiring timeline will shrink pretty dramatically, and but generally fraud will become more costly if you don't have the a good solution around it.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, go for it, Josh.
Okay, so I'll do two. No. One, I think that fraud is going to get worse in 3 years and it will be better in 5 years. This
Mm.
reminds me of the early internet e-commerce, where you kind of wanted to buy stuff online, but basically every time you did, you lost your credit card number to a scammer before they had, implemented SSL and all the technologies that make it so we don't even think about it today. It feels like the moment we're in when I look back. Um, I would say my other one is that fraud will look slightly different. So I think right now, especially in like digital remote roles, a lot of the wage arbitrage is letting someone in a different country potentially do the work. I think that we will eliminate people from that. And people will use kind of agent-based approaches to do kind of bad facsimiles of what a human would have done in the role. And so they'll use a real or fake ID to make it through the hiring process and then just hope that, ChatGPT 6 can do the job for them.
I will hold you to the 3 and 5 year. I
Okay.
hope a prediction like that. I will. What I was going to say, and actually, I think this is the benefit of working with a partner like Yardstik is, I think on the identity side, we're often really focused on like, are you who you say you are? And I think that will continue to be a really important question. But at least in the context of hiring, I see like education and employment verification or just like other signals related to one's history as a candidate becoming more important, or at least something
Mhm.
that will need to be integrated with IDV. So that's kind of my prediction too, of like the question of like what you might ask during the hiring process might really change.
Yeah, I also think that hiring and onboarding of people is probably going to be more specialized over time. So it might be the case that that you work really closely with recruiters or recruitment groups and who have access to specialty tools, similar to software development and that kind of thing, where you work with groups that have access to tools and you there's another layer of trust associated with that. The thought process behind that is really like it is a specialty task and it takes specialty tools in certain circumstances. And you want that extra layer of trust and maybe a layer of like insurance over that to assist you with identification and identifying real people.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was the last of the Q&A box, and I feel like that's a good place to leave it and gives folks like 5 minutes of their busy days back. Again, I just really want to thank you two, Josh and John, for taking the time to be with us today. And like I said, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar Please ignore my slides mishap in the beginning, but we would be super happy to chat with any folks on the call about candidate fraud. You can either reach out to Persona or Yardstik, and we'll be sure to coordinate on our end. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we're going to end the recording right now.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
It was a pleasure hanging out with you.
Likewise.